welcome back to the fourth episode of this series. We are recording the lesson number 3. Remember that we started these lessons from the number 0. So today we have a few things that we want to do in order that we finish all the events functionalities, and that basically is the integration between the user's events and the actions, right? So what I mean by that, we left behind 3 comments saying that we need to be able to subscribe to approve a subscription for one event. We need to be able to reject that. And so we have 3 main endpoints. One will be the request to be subscribed, the other will be the approval and the rejection. But the first thing that you guys need to remember that in order for us to be able to build that and doing that, we need first to create a new entity, right? Because right now we have in our models, we have a user and we have an event, and we need something to glue these things together, kind of a booking, right? So when you try, when you're booking for an event, you want to be part of that event, if that makes any sense. So we'll create another model. This model will be called, we could call booking either booking or registration. I prefer, I think, registration. That is kind of inside of the event. You register for the event. So it'll be register.js. This is will be basically we're going to start again. Let me make more screen. So this is basically, we'll be importing Mongoose at this point. So we need always Mongoose to define our new modules. If you are starting out now, what I suggest to you is always when I'm trying to build a new thing, you pause the video and you try to build yourself. So basically go to events and have a look in events. So then you're gonna notice that what's the structure, kind of structure that we have. In this case of the register event, will be, we're gonna create the register schema. This will be a new Mongoose schema. This takes an object with all the properties that we need. So basically we're going to have a date that will be a string because we need to know when you did apply to register for this. We will have approved as a Boolean. So Boolean is a property, is a primitive property from JavaScript that can either be true or false, right? So that's what we want. Did you subscribe to the event? Yes, I did. Did your subscription got approval? Like maybe have you paid for that, right? So no, yes. So we know that. So inside this, we also want to get the sport. So for which sport have you subscribed for, right? And this sport will be a string. And then below that, we want to do a connection between these and 2 extra things, right? First, the user. So remember, we kind of did that before. So if you come back to the events, we found the user there, right? So in this case, we're going to do basically the same thing. And this is telling to Mongoose, oops, be careful, I copied the entire object. So basically this is tells Mongoose, I want a user that sends this request and find him using the ID. In this case, Mongoose calls it object ID and make the reference. So every time that I make a query for a specific register schema, it will return me the user that did that request as well. And the other thing that we want to do is basically the same thing that we did, but instead of being the user now, is the event, because I want to know, is this registration made for which event, right? I want to get more information about the event. So in this particular case, we will have an object. It will be pretty much like the above one. So it'll be type mongoose dot schema dot type dot object ID, and the second property will be a reference, and this reference will be basically the reference that you did use it here, right? So that you understand where these names are coming from. So user is coming from the user. We define it as a user, right? And now we pass event. So there you have it. Now we have this new thing that glues all the parts together. Basically, what we want to do is export that. So there you have it. Basically, now we have these things that glues all the things together. Now what we want to do is export that, and that will be a mongoose.model, and the name of this model will be a registration. I think that's much better. Yeah, we rename the file registration. Yeah, that I know what that means. I think you guys will feel the same about this. So then here we pass the registration schema. So if you press F2 here, we can rename things. So registration schema. Yeah, so that we keep our code base clean and concise. So guys, there is also another shortcut that it might be worth to learn is Alt Shift F. This is also works on Windows machine. So if you do that, it will format for you automatically. I don't like to use auto format on save, and the reason that I don't like that is because I work with this uh, the same configuration in other projects and professional projects, and you don't want to be jumping files and saving and formatting all the files without even know what you have inside. So I prefer to use this shortcut instead when I need it. Okay, so the next thing that we need to do is basically look for the routes that we have. But before we do that, we need to remember to change this naming. This name, so I will update the file. If you rename there registration, this is will be registration model. Now we are in the same page. One of the things that will happen for us now is that we're going to create a new few new endpoints, right? So basically, we have the capability now to get event by ID. We can get all the events. We also can get events filtered by the sports. But now, something that we need to do is the approval, rejection, and subscribe controller, right? So the main thing that we need to do, I think we're going to start doing the approval controller. Let me change that. We're going to have let's put that below better. So basically, I'll show you what we need to do. We need to be able to get an event, not an event, a registration by ID. Then, if we get it, we need to be able to approve that. So that will be a registration approval controller, and then a registration rejection controller. So this is going to be the steps that we're going to do right now. So basically, another thing that I realized now, we will have a registration controller because we need to be able to create and also to get the registration. So the registration controller will be used here as well. If that makes sense. And the subscribe controller is the registration controller that we basically renamed that. Okay, so right now let's start writing the roads. So I will create the first thing, a registration, and then we can create, I guess, together we can create the controller, right? So in this case, the first thing that we need to do is create a new route. Will be a route dot post, because we want to create first the registration. Here's going to be called registration, and to be able to register that, we need to be able to pass an event ID. So it will be event ID like we did before, because we need to know in the registration process what's the event ID that you're creating this registration for, if that makes any sense. And then here we need to create a new controller to use, right? So let's create the registration controller now. So the registration controller will be basically a new controller, and we will need to create using the event, the registration module that we just created. So if we do const registration, this will be equal requires. Let's go to the module registration, right? And then we're going to do a model.export that we keep the same approach. And here let's have a first async create. This will be hack and res. Oops, it's not image bitmap. My autocomplete is a bit crap. I think I've installed some modules that is not right. Okay, so then basically, what do we need to fulfill in order to do this new registration controller? So let's have a look in user, in registration. So we need a date. We need to see if that's approved. We need to see which sport, which user. So there's a few things that we need to look in order to fulfill the events and the user. We need to know, remember the user ID, the events ID. So I guess we can start from there. So the first thing that we will need to take user ID. This will be from the rec.header. This will come from the header, because if you're logged in, the header will have that information already. So after that, we need to get the event ID. So we're going to have, let me see how I did that. So it was an event ID there. Okay, so we're going to have an event ID. This will be from rec.params, because we're passing a URL param, if you remember that. And then the next thing that we want the date, right? Because we said that will have a date. So if you come back here, you can see not user. If you go in registration, we need a date, we need a user, we need the event. The sport we're going to get as well. Basically, the sport will be coming from the event. So this sport, I think, really thinking about this sport, I think we don't need that. And I'm going to tell you why. We don't need that because we're going to have all the events information here. This is going to bring all the event information based on the event ID. And inside that event, we know the type of the events already. So I think that's kind of not needed. So here in the registration controller, all we need to create a new registration. So now we're going to await for a registration dot create. This will be a method with an object like we did before. Then we will do a user that will be a user ID. We will have a event that it will be event ID. I need to do comma there. Yeah, and then we will have the date. Date again, remember just using the shortcut, so the shortest way you can do, but basically this is the same that we do that, right? But because the property and the value that will be passed to the property has the same name, we can use this shortcut for objects, right? And so that's the same thing. Now that we have that, we will return the new registration. Yeah, that makes sense. So let's return, will be a response.json, and we will return the registration. So there you have it. Now we can test that. Yeah, I'm happy with that. Let's come back to the root. Now that we have a new controller, let's go under the last controller. We're going to say this is the registration controller. This is require controllers registration controller. Yeah, and then now inside here we pass the registration controller dot create, and that should be enough for us. So we will open Insomnia. Let me bring to this monitor. Yep. So now basically let's create a new folder here. This new folder will be called registration. I'm happy with this name. So inside the registration, we're going to have the first create method. This will be a post request, and I think we want a JSON object. So then inside here, let's start building up the URL. The URL will be basically registration with not capital. So registration. Now here we need to pass an event ID, right? In the header, we need to have a user ID. Basically for us to get the user ID, we can come back to the user, see, could be this user ID here that I have. If you don't have yet, you just do another get, but you probably have the same there. Remember that I'm copying my ID. You need to copy yours because MongoDB will be different. It will be generate different IDs, right? We're going to send this value as a user ID. The event ID, basically I will be copying get event by ID. So I know that I can see all the events, checking in events. Oh, we changed for dashboard. Yep. So now that we have the dashboard, let's grab this one, come back here. See what I'm doing? I'm creating a new event, a new registration that basically has an event ID, a user in the header, and inside here we need to send an object that will have a date string that will have the present date. I will use my format. You can format differently if you want to, accordingly where you're based. So now will be my request. So now that I have the registration, let's have a look if that matches. Yeah, registration, event ID, make sure that I have a user ID. We can double check here, event, date. And if you look inside the registration module, we can see we have a date as a string, right? So now that we have everything that we needed, let's send the request. And we got back this. Oh, we missed a part. This is my mistake. So basically, I've just reminded now, when you have a new controller that needs, in this case, I have the user ID, I have an event, and I have a date, but I forgot to tell Mongoose to do something. We need to await for basically the registration now, and then we can do .populate. We want to populate the event, and we also want to populate the user, right? And then after that we populate everything, we need to finish to execute populate. This is basically, we'll save the information inside. So now if you save that and we send the request back, we should have complete information. So let's try that again. Let me double check what we're getting here, right? Let's debug that together. If you do console.log, user ID, event ID, and date, let's see here in the console, what do we get? There you have it. Now we know why it doesn't populate anything. So basically, user ID is coming from, oh, I'm missing an S here, and I'm missing an S here. See guys, so that's the good part of debugging together, because we can learn all together. There you have it. So now we have a completely event. As you see, this is, I think, is incredible. I'm not sure about you, but see the user, right? It went there and fetched the entire user. And that's amazing. And then it fetched the event, including all the properties of the event. And I think that's awesome. It's super nice. So another thing that we can do basically to make sure that we are protecting our user is remove the password from inside the user object. And that's because we don't want the password, right? Like we shouldn't, this is like the difference between you keep your functionality doing just what it needs. So if you don't need the password of the user, and I don't, because I'm not looking if the user is logged in, or I'm not trying to log in the user, so we should remove that. So that if you look the populate, you can void things, right? And then basically if you return as a second argument password, like so, this should remove the password. Let's test together. Boom. So we no longer have a password. That's much better. You don't want it to send your password to anywhere if you don't need to. It's the same, like imagine you have a user that inside the user's module, you have credit cards stored there, right? Because at some point you will need that information to process some payments. But right here, we don't need that, because like it's not this is like against the rules of singularity, right? Like the registration controller, this is basically registering all events that we have. The login controller needs to know the password, right? So we are splitting the concerns by different parts of the code. So I'm much happier now with that. So the next thing that we need to do is basically, now that we generated a new registration, is creating another method that will be able to get that registration from us, right? So we can create another method. This will be async get registration. Get registration. I can't spell today, sorry. So this is also, we'll have a rec and res as we normally do. This will be much simpler. So this will be, we need just to know the registration ID, right? And this should come from the params. And basically here we can do a try and a catch. And what we can say const registration. Will be equals to, stop and try doing yourself to see if you memorize all this stuff, but I'll carry on now. So this is equals to await. This will be registration dot find by ID, and then inside here we need to pass the registration ID. This should return to us the registration if we have one. So then basically what we can do here, we need just to return registration response.json and the registration. There's no secret here. I think we did that quite a few times, so that will be a nice exercise if you try to do that yourself. And if you did and you managed to do that, congrats. So return, you will return here in case of an error a response.status 400. Remember that, .json. And here we want to send an error, a message. We sending a message. We can say registration not found, right? This should be it. Now we can copy this one. The controller is there already. So basically what we need to do now is we have the registration create, but now what we want is a route that will have a get method request, a registration, and here now will be basically the here will be the registration ID. Correct? Yep. And then here we can do dot get registration ID. That should be enough. Let's create this so that we can test now. Basically, if you come back to Insomnia, now what you can do, you have this new ID. So I'm gonna copy this. This is the ID of the event, and the user has its own ID inside. But this on top here, this is the registration ID, and the date, you can see that is the date that I've sent. So here now I'm gonna create a new request. This will be a get request. So say get registration, and basically is the URL registration, and I'll paste that ID here, and we should be good to test that. Yeah. So now we know that we have a registration. This is interesting because when you get the registration, it's not being populated. So we can do such a similar thing that we did before to populate everything. Yeah, I think we can do basically what we did here. Do that again. So we can await these things. It's just copy and paste really because it's the same name. And now if you get this again, hey, so now we have a much complete registration. And if you guys look inside the registration, we have the prove it property that we're not doing anything with that yet, right? So that's what we're going to do next. So basically now that we have the registration, we need to go to routes and see what else we need to do. So this is now is done, registration controller, get registration controller, right? So now the next thing will be the approval controller. So we're going to create another file that will be ApprovalController.js. See guys, this is like a really nice tip. I would like to advise you to do that. Think first what you're doing. Make sure you have like a few to-dos that you're like guiding yourself through. You're not like finding stuff out. This helps quite a lot during the development and helps your brain to think exactly what you need to do. So inside this new controller, this will be interesting. We just need to get the registration, the module. So this will be equals to a require. So inside the modules, we will have the registration that we're looking for. And then module.export. This is equals the object. Here we're going to have basically approval method, right? Async approval. Approval. This is will take hack and res. And let's work this out. We initially need to get, if you want to approve or like deny a request, you have some ways of doing that, right? But for now, we need to get first thing first will be the registration ID, right? Registration ID. This will be coming from the rec params. That is from the URL, by the way, like we did previously. And then once we have that, we can create the registration again here. And this will be equals to await because it's a promise. So we need to await the booking quarter. So this is a promise. We need to wait for the registration. So basically now we do the registration, find by ID. We will pass the ID here. Once we have the registration that we found it, basically now what we can do, we can edit the object inside of it. So if you do registration.approved equals to true, and then we need to do another await registration dot save because we changed the object and now we want the mongoose to save that. Once that is done, you can return the JSON of it. And basically, this is just the registration. Response.json, that's what we want to return. So the only thing I would say, because we're doing two operations here, let's do a try and catch. And let's move all this code here. You can hold the Alt arrow up and you can leave that inside. Now in the catch, what we want to do is return a rest.status 400.json and the error, right? If something goes wrong, return the error. We're not sending message at this point. We could send a message, but that basically is the approval controller. So let's take advantage that we're doing that, and let's create the rejection controller now. That will basically, it will be a very similar one. So if you look the rejection controller, it will be basically the same thing. We can copy the same thing that we have here. I will copy the entire thing. We will paste here and we'll change this to false. Right? So that was quick and easy to made up. So now inside the routes, we have now two new controllers that we want to use. So then basically let's create the new routes here that will help us to do that. Essentially, the approval, the pattern that I like to use is very similar to this one. So what I'm going to do now will be routes.post, because it will be a post request. This changes something inside the object. So registration, and then we will have a registration ID. Let me copy that because I can't spell. Yeah. And then basically now the only difference is that I like to use this pattern, right? So this will be approval. And the only difference in the other route will be that here will be the rejection, right? So this will be the approvals, and this will be the rejections. And then if you use here the registration controller, oops, is the approval controller, sorry. We need to import the both controllers. So const approval controller require controllers. There you have it. And now we need to do the rejection controller. This also require controllers, rejection controller. So this is basically the both things that we will need there. So now if you get the approval controller approval, we need to rename that, right? I forgot to rename it. This will be the rejection, right? Rejection controller, approval controller. So there's a few conventions that people start to use. You can use like a store when you're saving. You can use get when you're getting. There's different ones. I didn't want to complicate everything in the first time, so that's why I'm trying to use the methods as more descriptive as possible. So in this case, it would be the rejection controller dot rejection. It kind of sounds a little bit of redundant because this is the rejection controller and they're very specific, but I prefer to do that. If you want to change or if you have a different ways, that's fine. So now because I read the code, I really know what that is doing, right? We don't need to even think that. So that's what we need. Now we're going to create Insomnia, two extra things that basically will be the first one. Let's do an approval first. So this will be approval. The approval will be a post request. I will copy the URL from this. This will be very similar. So we need a registration. This is a method that we have. And then here will be approvals, right? Basically, that's it. If you send there, oops, bad request. Let me see what I'm doing wrong. Right, guys, let's debug that together then. Console.log registration ID. This is oh, we're missing the S again, guys. That was all about the S again. Sorry guys, I'm really sorry about that. So let's try quarter. So let's try this again, quarter. Sorry guys, really sorry about that. So let's try this again now. There we go, approve it. So now if you go in get registration and get the same registration, it is approve it, right? And we're going to basically do the same for the rejection. So we're going to create here another request. This will be the rejection request so that we can test. This will be the same URL. I need to change the method signature, so it's not get, it's a post. And then the approval will be the rejections. If you send that, approve it false. So now we can come back here, get this again, false. The only thing that I would say, be careful. We will have a video in the future to add more advanced functionality, including WebSockets and other things. And because right now, of course, if you really think about this, we're not doing any kind of validation here. So this means what happens if I'm not the owner of the event? Should I be able to you know to approve or to reject a request? I shouldn't, right? So that's what we're going to do in the future. So there's a few functionalities that involve more complex things that I want to keep for the future. So there you have it, guys. I think we are in a state where we can start our front end. So I think this is basically what we can do. We have enough routers, enough services working, so we can start building our React application, right? So that's it, guys. Thank you very much for being with me during this series. This is our fourth episode. I will start the next episode doing the front end. So I hope that you have fun so far. Yeah, I'll just would like to ask you for the support. So if you didn't subscribe yet, make sure that you subscribe, and please leave a like in these videos so that we can the YouTube algorithm can help us to spread these videos for more people. Thank you very much. I really appreciate your help. Take care.